all too well over the times that you've been going to church. After these events, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Abraham answered him, I'm here. God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up as an entirely burned offering there on one of the mountains that I will show you. Abraham got up early in the morning, harnessed his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, together with his son Isaac. He split the wood for the entirely burned offering, set out, and went to the place of God, the place that God had described to him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place at a distance. Abraham said to his servants, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will walk up there, worship, and then come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the entirely burned offering and laid it on his son Isaac. He took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, my father. Abraham said, I'm here, my son. And Isaac said, here's the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the entirely burned offering? Abraham said, the lamb for the entirely burned offering? God will see to it, my son. The 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place God had described to him. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. But the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Abraham said, I'm here. The messenger said, don't stretch out your hand against this young man and don't do anything to him. I know that you revere God and didn't hold back your son, your only son, from me. Abraham looked up and saw a single ram caught by its horns in the dense underbrush. Abraham went over, took the ram, and offered it as an entirely burned offering instead of his son. Abraham named that place, the Lord sees. That is the reason people today say, on this mountain, the Lord is seen. Gary.
Thanks, Rob. That was powerful reading. It was also the way you read it, slow, deliberative. It's the story itself that is also carries a lot of power. Just in terms of storytelling itself. Did y'all get a chance, some of you at least, I hope, to look at that link, that blog from Rachel Held Evans? Yeah, it's worth a read. So it was in the you get credit, Chloe. It's worth looking at, going back and looking at if you have a chance in the mailing that went out on Saturday. Because she has some thoughts similar to some of the things I want to share this morning about this story. I think we can say, I know we can say a lot of things about the Bible. It's puzzling, yet compelling. It's inconsistent, yet surprisingly unified. Sometimes we want to pitch it, yet we hold on to it because it has authoritative value for us. Of all the biblical stories, the story of Abraham's almost sacrifice of his son Isaac, for me at least, captures that complex mix of feelings. My own personal life, I have had periods where I have pondered this story for the very existential dilemma that it presents when faced with the push and pull of hard choices. What is the right thing to do when a decision may require a great sacrifice? Will God provide a lamb at the last minute? One has to assume, unless God is just messing with us, that may not happen. So what is the right thing to do? Will I be blessed if I take this path instead of that one? What if the ram doesn't appear and I go through with the sacrifice? Would I survive? Would I wonder always if the decision I made was truly God's will? These are some of the questions the story presents to me anyway. While that application of Scripture intersecting with my own personal life has been a valuable parable at times, the question I have been wondering about recently is more universal. The question of conscience. In terms of living out our faith, I ask, what role does moral conscience play in the big decisions we need to make? A big reason this story of Abraham and the almost sacrifice of Isaac is so powerful, I believe, is because it touches upon our deepest moral conscience. It's terrifying. If we had heard this story for the first time, or even if we've heard it 1,000 times, we're naturally saying to ourselves, don't do it, Abraham. Don't plunge that knife into your son. Let's see a show of hands. How many vote for Abraham to defy what God is asking of him? Okay. How many think Abraham's faith is radical, even admirable? You can be both. How many think Abraham's is radical but dangerous and messed up? All right. If you voted yes on all three of those questions, I would probably be with you. To my thinking, Abraham's faith was A, radical in an inspiring way, taking risks, trusting God, putting it all on the line. And B, Abraham's faith was radical, but not in a good way. If actually applied, it would be dangerous and, as I said, messed up. How did he know it was God's voice and not the devil's or schizophrenia? Shouldn't he have checked it out with others for discernment? Why didn't he have the courage to defy God and trust his own moral compass? For me, this multi-dimensional quality of biblical stories, such as this one, are why we value the biblical tradition. As I told you a number of Sundays ago, this preacher, me, traffics in sacred narratives, often the more dramatic, incredulous, and troubling, the better. If you voted for Abraham to defy God's request to offer his son on the altar of death, you are basically saying that you personally wouldn't have obeyed. And why? For me, at least, it comes down to the power of moral conscience. I believe the voice of God speaks through our moral conscience. So how can God ask Abraham to do something that he knows is morally wrong and violates that conscience? Now, I want to pause here for just a moment and confess that how I am presenting the questions about this story is not the way it was intended for the ears of the ancient Near Eastern listeners. Many scholars tell us that this is a very, very old story, told as a counter story to the sometimes practiced ritual of human sacrifice. And so the story is intended to be a counter-narrative teaching that human sacrifice is not God's will. Other scholars tell us this is a story about what it means to have faith of such power and depth that Abraham would go to the most extreme ends to follow in what God instructs him to do without question, complete trust despite the human desire to want to resist. Others see this story as a precursor to the Christian story. I am taking a more imaginative approach this morning to raise questions about, one, hearing God's voice. What is that really? Two, the role of the moral conscience in our walk of faith. And three, how do we discern what is the right course of action? Community discernment, after all, is an Anabaptist virtue, and I might add, the Quakers have a lot to teach us about discernment within community also. A couple of common hymns come to mind that we in the Mennonite Church may have sung. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. Or obey my voice. Obedience has always been an articulated value of the Mennonite Church. A blind obedience, however, is not a virtue. I contend that faithful obedience must be somehow congruent with our moral conscience. To do otherwise is to suffer what is called moral injury. Moral injury, as defined, is acting immorally in contradiction to one's moral conscience. War, for instance, is one of those situations where combatants, be they voluntary or conscripted, are most in danger of moral injury. Killing of humans, and some would argue all animal life, is injurious to our spiritual natures, which we all have. And yet, when it comes to war, some would argue they are fighting or killing for a larger, more moral cause. Or a situation is created whereby combatants kill in very, very difficult situations to not let down their platoon or their group, where everyone depends on everyone else for survival. Or one could take the example, for instance, of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who conspired to murder Hitler at the risk of his own mortal soul, because it was, in his mind, as a man of deep faith, and the necessary, if not moral, thing to do. And just like the dilemma presented to us by the Abraham and Isaac story, the question presented to in the Bonhoeffer case is, what would you do? Bonhoeffer was a deeply moral individual. He was thoughtful, prayerful, and tortured by the nuances of the situation. But what about others? What about misguided people who do all kinds of awful, morally offensive things and yet believe they are being faithful to God? Blowing up buses, burning churches, genociding whole peoples. We must ask, what happened to their moral compass? We can just as well ask, where was the moral compass of the centurions who drove the nails into Jesus' hands and feet? And I suppose most personally, we should ask the question, what about our moral compass? Or what about the moral compass of collectives, of nations? It seems clear to me that societies collectively carry the moral heart for the people. You're wondering, no doubt, what has happened to the moral heart, or at least I do, of this nation. Why is it that good people of faith seem to support cruelty, even though they individually are caring and loving? Why can't we all see the cruelty of mass deportations or cutting off aid to those struggling in materially poor nations? Why cut programs that help people eat or have medical care or get educated? Where is the nation's moral heart when it basically disappears people off the street, seen as illegal? Under similar circumstances, the great Hebrew prophets spoke. Just like the prophet Jeremiah felt he was in the middle of a nation that had lost its moral way. In chapter 6, he's outside the gates of the temple, and he cries, "For from the least to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. And from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace. They acted shamefully, they committed abomination, and yet they were not ashamed. They did not know how to blush." When an indicted international war criminal comes to visit the White House and gives a 34-time convicted felon president a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, I think the absurdity of that would have easily be understood by the prophet Jeremiah. Peace, peace. There is no peace. We're not the first nation to experience moral amnesia, and we will not be the last. And while it is fitting for us to ponder the Abraham and Isaac story as a tale by which to consider our own personal sense of moral conscience, the prophets remind us that our calling as a people of God is to be a moral voice that calls the nation back and to remember what it must have, that it must have a collective moral ethos if it is to survive, let alone thrive. And mind you, the prophets speak to all of us. We are all challenged, we are all implicated. The church's role, this church's role, along with others, is to care for the least, to seek justice, and to act with charity, and to seek the shalom of the whole. We have a long way to go, but that is our call. We live in an era when the writing is on the wall, it seems to me. The time of hatred and war and poverty have to be addressed. The sacrifices at the altar of war and division, that era is done. Set before us are the ways of life and death, as outlined in Deuteronomy 30. The scriptures implore us to choose life. Christ has shown us the way that leads to life. And because we are followers of that way, we can trust that we can be empowered also by the Spirit to cry out for and to act for justice and to pray for peace. What more can we do? May God give us such strength to be faithful to that call.